O dabar bus įdomiai, ta antra dalis, tarp kitko, bus mums suprantama kalba, reiškia, anglų, reiškia, tai ne lietuviška. Ir tą pristatys daktaras Juozas. Ir kaip tik matėte, jeigu nežiūrėti programą, ten yra nuotrauka Juozuko su tėvu. Tai yra įdomi pažiūrėti, kas dar nematė, po šito pažiūrėkit, reiškia, kaip jis tada atrodė. Tikrai gražus vyras buvo. Tai prašau.
Labai ačiū, Eligijau. Yes, I will be talking in English for a variety of reasons, not least of which because you will enjoy my talk more if I use this language than the language of my birth. Anyway, today, the whole day, we have the theme of Kaunas, life in Kaunas and recreation of Kaunas. Some of you, or at least who are here, have already seen a very interesting, or heard a very interesting lecture on the Lithuanianization of Kaunas. And today I would like to talk about life in Kaunas in the 1930s, sharing some insights about the everyday life of ordinary people. Just a second. This is to keep me from talking hours and hours. I do have a timer here. The data for this talk is taken from a doctoral dissertation published in Lithuania in 1939 by Dr. Petro Kazlauskas. He was my father. Our family name was Kazlauskas until we got American citizenship in 1954, and then we became Kazlas. The title is Kauno pradžios mokyklų mokinių akių tyrimai. In English, eye examinations of pupils in Kaunas elementary schools. I think it's a very rare study which should be better known and should be used by professional historians who want and sociologists who want to study life in Lithuania, especially in Kaunas, in the 1930s. In the spring of 1935 and the fall of 1936, Kazlauskas and his assistants conducted examinations of elementary school pupils' eyesight. My father was an ophthalmologist, and this was his doctoral dissertation for his specialty. And they were handing out questionnaires for the pupils together with their parents or guardians to fill out before they came to school to have their eyes examined by my father and or his assistants. And the questionnaire response on which this talk is based was by 9,601 pupils, or 76% of all elementary school pupils in Kaunas. Now, the research was not done using a random sample so that you could get for sure some sort of a representative picture of Lithuania. However, as Marx once said, at some point quantity turns into quality. If you get answers from 76% of all the pupils in the city, you're going to have a reasonably good picture of what life is like in that city at that time. First of all, the ethnicity of the pupils. Pupils came from Lithuanian families. 71% of the pupils came from Lithuanian families. 21% came from Jewish families. 4% Russian, 3.5% German, and less than 1% Polish. I'm not going to get into the details of who was more or less than various censuses show, but I would say that it's at least reasonable, a reasonable proportion of the students were in all the ethnic groups. And the other thing we have to remember is that this research was not based on the entire population of Kaunas, but only on its juvenile component, on the pupils who were going to the elementary school. So if some ethnic groups had larger numbers of children, that would be reflected, and it would diverge from the statistics of the total population. In addition to the ethnic background, the Kazlausko study gives the occupational category of the children's parents or guardians. Now, the social structure that was used in this study was of 4 occupational categories. They're not occupational categories that are normally used by social scientists. The first one was intelligente, and Kazlauskas always gave some examples of who would be in that category. So intelligente, which included professors, school teachers, no surprise there, military officers, government officials, theater people, music performers. So this paper, and when I talk to you about it, occupational categories, we'll translate the term intelligente as professionals, because I think that's the closest to what we would consider in an American context. The second category was miestiečiai, or townspeople, which were examples: merchants, craftsmen, landlords, policemen, bus or train conductors, mailmen. And I translated it as skilled workers, both white collar and blue collar. The third category, jodadarbe, the black workers, so to speak, land tillers, maids, watchmen, laundresses, fishermen, porters, stokers, workers. And this I translated as unskilled workers. And finally, the darbe, the unemployed. Looking at the total number of answers from the pupils, 10% came from professional families, 37% came from skilled families, 49% from unskilled families, and 3% from the unemployed. Looking at the social composition of the ethnic groups, the social composition of the Lithuanian parents resembled a pyramid. That is, 13% of the Lithuanian families were professional, 33% skilled, 51% unskilled. So the majority were unskilled workers. The Jewish parents, on the other hand, were only 5% professionals. Strange, I said to myself, 5% professional Jews? Remember, professionals in this category included government officials and the military. Okay, so they were only 5% professionals, but over half, 54%, were skilled workers, and only 38% were unskilled. The Germans were roughly half skilled and half unskilled workers, and the Russians had the largest proportion of parents who were unskilled. 83% of pupils came from unskilled worker families. The Poles were in second place, by the way, 57% unskilled. So, combining the two higher occupational categories, that is the professionals and the skilled, Lithuanians constituted 68% of the entire subtotal professional and skilled, and the Jews 26%. However, while Lithuanians constituted 74% of the two lower categories, that is, unskilled and unemployed, Jews constituted only 16%. I know this is a lot of statistics. I'm just mentioning this because when we're talking only about the occupational categories, there will be a little bit of, like, well, the unskilled and the skilled workers, the two lower categories, we're talking 74% of these people are Lithuanian. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get across. So several days before Kazlauskas and his assistants visited the schools, they would have the children take a questionnaire home and with the help of their parents or guardians fill it out. And the questionnaire was about two things. Number one, living conditions. How much space did they have at home? Were their living quarters light? Were they damp? And hygienic practices. The reason for this was that he was studying the health of their eyes. So there were no political or ideological or other motives for asking questions about their ordinary life other than to see how it would affect their eyesight. Okay, you have to keep that in mind. Looking at the number of persons living per room, okay? Two things strike one immediately. Number one, living conditions in Kaunas were quite crowded. The average child in Kaunas lived in a home which had 4.5 persons per room. Number two, there were significant differences among the ethnic groups. Jewish children lived in homes which were the least crowded, followed by the Germans. The Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian children were more crowded than average. Here's some examples of the pupils who lived 5 people or more per room. The Jewish children, there were only 29%. The Lithuanian children, 51%. The majority of Lithuanian children lived in living quarters which had 5 or more people per room. The Russian children, 71% lived in such quarters. Okay, so since the ethnic groups differed in their occupational composition, this accounted for at least part of the differences in their standard of living. On the average, children of professionals lived 3 to a room. The children of skilled workers 4 to a room, and the children of unskilled or unemployed parents 5 to a room. Here's a statistic to keep in mind. Over 1/5 of the children of unskilled or unemployed parents, over 1/5, lived 7 or more to a room. Overall, the ranking of the ethnic groups held within each occupational category. Jews, on average, had the most space, followed by the Germans. Lithuanians were in 3rd place. The Russians tended to live in the most crowded conditions within each category. The second measure of spatial conditions involved the number of persons who slept per bed. Okay? Now, the ranking of the ethnic groups produced a similar pattern. But first of all, I'd like to say that the situation of sleeping in bed was not as crowded as the rooms. So, for example, 82% of the children of professionals slept in their own bed, not sharing with anyone else. 59% of the skilled had a bed to themselves. 39% of the unskilled children, that is, children from families of unskilled workers, 39% had a bed of their own. And only 33%, only 1/3 of unemployed children had a bed to themselves. On the other hand, you also had, among unskilled workers, 8% of the children slept 3 to 5 or more in one bed. And of the unemployed, 13% slept 3 to 5 or more in one bed. The ranking for the ethnic groups was followed a similar pattern. Jewish and German children slept in conditions more spacious, while Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian slept in conditions more crowded than average. And this held within each occupational stratum. The differences in sleeping arrangements were not as striking as the variation in housing. 95% of the children slept alone or with one other person. Okay. Although 8% of the children of the unskilled parents and 13% of those in unemployed families slept in beds containing 3 or more persons, often with adults and children sleeping together. Only rarely were there cases of entire families of 7 or 9 people sleeping together. And at that point, then, usually the floor itself served as a bed, usually with some straw on it. Okay, so much for space. Now for the quality of the housing. The quality indicator was a subjective indicator. So, it's not clear whether a dissatisfied answer meant that the respondent was objectively worse off than somebody who gave a positive answer, or simply found the same conditions less tolerable. For professionals, all the children were asked, is your housing dark, is it damp, or is it good? So, in order to hurry up this report, I'll just talk about good. Children of professionals, 95% said they had good housing. Children of the skilled workers, 83%. Children of the unskilled, also 83%. Children of the unemployed, 58% said they had good housing. Not too dark, not too damp. There was a small variation in terms of whether the housing had sufficient light or was dark, but there was much stronger disparity in dampness. One is struck by the favorable position of the Lithuanians relative to Germans and Jews in terms of the quality of their housing concerning darkness. So up until now, we say the Germans and the Jews had more spacious housing, but all of a sudden you talk about the quality of the housing and the Lithuanians are doing better. So, for example, of the answers of the pupils, the Lithuanian pupils, 6% of them said that their housing was damp. 12% of the Germans, twice as many German pupils in percentage terms, said that their housing was damp. 18% of the Jewish pupils found their housing damp. Russians were 19%, and the Poles, 25% of the Polish respondents found their housing damp. You may have noticed, those of you who were here for the first lecture, that I asked, did people in different ethnic groups tend to congregate in different neighborhoods. And that was precisely because how to answer this puzzle, my guess is that the Jewish children tended to live in the Old Town, and he in fact said they live in the Old Town, which probably, I don't know, but I'm guessing, probably Old Town had larger apartments, but older buildings, and therefore they were more damp. Maybe. I would love it if future historians take some of this data and follow up on some of the anomalies that are raised. Here's another anomaly. The percentage of Jewish and Lithuanian professionals who reported having good housing was very high and nearly identical. If you were a professional Jew, it was 96% good housing, a professional Lithuanian, 94% good housing. However, the percentage of Lithuanians reporting good housing was similar among the skilled and the unskilled workers, while it dropped sharply for unskilled Germans and especially for Jews. 66% of the Jews said that they had good unskilled Jews said that they had good housing. They were in fourth place, actually. So it seems that socioeconomic background had a stronger effect on housing quality for Jewish pupils than for other ethnic groups and others. Something else, again, something else to examine in a future study. We go to another quality of life, food. Even more important than housing and maintaining a child's health. 12% of children in total complained of not getting enough to eat. As Kazlauskas pointed out, this did not mean that the other 88% were well fed, because the question referred only to the quantity of the food, not to its nutritional quality. Again, there was a clear decline in the percentage of pupils with enough to eat by occupational category. 100% of the children of professionals said they had enough to eat. 95% of the skilled workers, 83% of the unskilled, and only 56% of the unemployed families said they had enough to eat. So it really is somewhat shocking to think that almost half of the unemployed families, children, said that they did not get enough to eat. Again, you can say this is a subjective criteria. One person may be hungry when another one is not, along with the same amount of food. And they were being asked, did you get enough food? Meaning, were you feeling hungry? There was a certain occupational variation. However, it seems clear that there was a significant amount of hunger among a significant minority of the pupils. Okay, enough for living conditions and food. Next topic, cultural conditioning or hygienic habits. Kazlauskas asked two types of questions about hygienic habits. Number one, did the child have his or her own towel, or did they share a towel with other members of their family? Again, remember, he's studying what causes eye disease. Okay, so that's why he's saying, do you have your own towel? Another question is, a wash bowl. When you wash your face, do you have your own bowl? If you do not, if you share a bowl with other people, do you normally pour out the water and put in fresh water? Or do you use the same water that was used by someone else before you washed your face? In general, 1/3 of the children had their own towels. We're talking all occupations, all ethnic categories. 1/3 of the children had their own towels. 2/3 shared a towel with other members of their family. 26% had their own wash bowl. 72% shared a bowl but changed the water. And only 2% washed in water which had been previously used by someone else. There was a clear pattern of higher occupational strata tending to follow good hygienic practice more faithfully. So in terms of separate towels, 65% of professionals had a separate towel. The children of professionals had separate towels. 42% of the skilled workers, 21% of the unskilled, and again, 21% of the unemployed. Kazlauskas pointed out that personal hygienic habits were quite susceptible to improvement through public education. Kazlauskas encountered many cases of families which could not afford good housing, but provided their children with separate towels. While 36% of the professionals and 58% of skilled family children used towels in common. His explanation was that public health lectures were usually delivered to workers and were rarely attended by professionals. Interesting. Similarly, military families tended to have good hygienic habits, even if the father had a low rank in the army. And this follows a lot of social science studies which talk about the role of armies in developing countries, that they are not just militaristic, but they actually inculcate various habits that are necessary for living in, a modern society. Over 1/3 of German, Jewish, and Lithuanian children had separate towels, while Polish and Russian children were more prone to share common towels. About 1/3 of Jewish children had separate bowls, followed by 1/4 of Lithuanian children. I'm not going to go into the rest of the statistics because I know your eyes will glaze over. By the way, at the end of all these statistics, I have 2.5 pages of non-statistical discussion of what I think about all this. So this is like holding out dessert. If you eat your vegetables, you'll get dessert. Controlling ethnicity by occupation shows a more complex pattern. Children of Jewish professionals were significantly more likely to have separate towels and wash bowls than children of Lithuanian professionals. Okay, that's kind of something you'd expect. However, unskilled workers. Jewish families had the highest level of providing separate towels and bowls among professional and skilled families, but only 15% of Jewish pupils from unskilled families had separate towels. Significantly below German, 31%, Lithuanian, 23%, unskilled families. So again, there seems to have been a real occupational effect, much stronger than in other ethnic groups, in the hygienic habits of the Jewish children, families. Good, but my father's a doctor, right? He was a doctor. He studied ophthalmology. So does all this mean anything in terms of eye disease? Respondents were asked to report any eye illness suffered in the past, either by themselves or by their family, or by someone in the family. Kazlauskas warned the reader that respondents were likely to remember only major eye illnesses, particularly those that required them to go to a doctor or a hospital. Okay? So, I'm going to just go through the statistics of children who reported themselves having eye disease. And these questionnaires were filled out with the help of their parents or guardians. So, Polish children, 18% had eye disease. German children, 13%. Russian children, 12%. Lithuanian children, 12%. Jewish children, 9%. The rank orders, as you would expect, except for the eye disease of German pupils, who had the second highest percentage of eye problems after the Poles, the Germans. We always think of Germans as being extraordinarily, clean, healthy, and so forth. So don't ask me during the question and answer period, because I'm telling you right now, I have no answer for this. However, it may be, as my father warned, perhaps German parents sought medical aid more frequently, and they tend to remember those diseases when they had to go to a doctor or a hospital. That's the only hypothesis that I can imagine of why they would have such a high rate of eye disease. The examination of the Kauno elementary school pupils found 19% with defective eyesight. So after the questionnaire, right, they came to school and my father and or his assistants would peer into the eyes, do an actual medical examination of the pupils. So only 4%, 3.6 if you want the exact number, 3.6% of the pupils had eye infections. The remaining 96.4%, again, 18.8% had defective eyesight. Of those 18.8%, only 3.6% had infections. The remaining 96.4% had ametropia, which, quickly looking in some encyclopedia, I found means having astigmatism or short-sightedness. In other words, they needed glasses. Okay. Only 6% of pupils with ametropia wore eyeglasses. Kazlauskas mentioned that he wrote out eyeglass prescriptions for 308 pupils whose eyesight was extremely poor, and who he was convinced would never go to an eye doctor. Unfortunately, he also added that he doubted that all of them went on to get the eyeglasses, either because of poverty or for some other reason. Okay, here's the discussion. Here's my overview of what all these numbers mean. Again, any evaluation of the Kazlauskas data must begin with a caveat that it was not intended as a sociological study. It made no attempt to ensure that the sample would be representative of Kauno elementary school pupils, much less of the general population. Number two, some of the questions, the answers require subjective evaluations by the pupils or whoever filled out the questionnaire for the pupils. And third, since this was not a study of the entire population of Kaunas, it overrepresents ethnic and social groups with large families because it's children, okay, and more children come from large families. By the same token, It tends to emphasize poor families living in bad conditions, since, as Kazlauskas observed, it was precisely the largest families which lived in the worst conditions. So if some of us are shocked because this sounds much worse than we had imagined life in Kaunas to be, I still think it's an accurate picture, but it may be not totally as bad because there's a slight slant in favor of large families, which are generally poor families and hence generally tend to have poor living conditions and habits. Nevertheless, it is clear that housing in Kaunas was rather crowded by present-day standards. Almost half of the children lived 5 or more people to a room. Sleeping arrangements were somewhat better. 95% slept 1 or 2 to bed. The quality of the housing was better. This bed spaciousness was better than the general spaciousness. Sorry, I'm misreading my own paper. The quality of the housing in terms of damp, dark housing, it was better than its spaciousness. 1 child in 6 complained of a dark or damp apartment or house. There were also public health problems. 1 child in 9 complained of hunger. And while 98% of the children washed their faces in fresh water, only 33% had their own towel. Of course, it may be difficult to provide separate towels for every child in a large family, and some hygiene may have been observed through frequent changing of common towels. That's also a possibility. In order to explain these conditions, we have to look at the historical perspective. Most Lithuanian cities were actually not particularly congested, since there was only a moderate shift of the population from the countryside into urban areas. Kaunas was the exception. It was the great metropolis. It experienced explosive growth. Its population grew from 40,000 in 1919 to 104,000 in 1934. Which was the year before my father did the study. In 15 years, the city grew by 160%, 160%. Even a society with plenty of capital for construction would have difficulty in coping with such a development. And just as New York contains modern skyscrapers and urban slums, so too Kaunas produced modern public buildings and a slum which was nicknamed Brazilka, after Brazil in South America. Still, it's clear from the Kazlausko statistics that the burden of modernization was distributed unequally among the various social strata of the population. His dissertation frequently takes on a tone of indignation when describing the living conditions of the poor. He was a Christian Democrat. While 40% of the children in the professional stratum lived 1 or 2 persons to a room, only about 8% of unskilled and unemployed did so. 60% of unskilled and unemployed children lived 5 to a room or more, while only 17% of the professional strata did so. 100% of the professional children had enough to eat, but only 83% of the unskilled and 56% of the unemployed had enough to eat. I'm going to read directly from the dissertation, a comment that Kazlauskas made. I learned that some of them live in very bad conditions. A couple of examples. A family of 11 persons lives in one room. Some of them lie on the floor, covered with straw for a bed, others in beds with 3 or 4 people. A school-age boy or girl lies in one bed with their parents. Of course, living like this, conditions for learning are difficult, and the child wilts physically and spiritually. And that's not all. That family rented its kitchen to another 5-person family. Further down, he says, one cannot avoid pointing out that a large percentage of pupils live in bad apartments. So the health of the children withers while they are at a delicate age. They walk around pale, without enthusiasm to work and to live. They spend a good part of their young lives in damp, dusty rooms filled with CO2 from people breathing and with tobacco smoke from adults. To defend Kaunas, I would point out that these realities have to be also, well, it requires a comparison with other developing countries. Did the inhabitants of the Brasilka slum live better or worse than their equivalents in Brazil? That is, new people coming out of the countryside and entering large cities. I also like this one statistic, weekly wages of an industrial worker in Lithuania in 1938 bought a third of a woolen suit, and in the USSR, less than 1% of a suit. In Lithuania, the weekly wages of an industrial worker bought 60 pounds of meat. In the Soviet Union, 4.3 pounds of meat. The Lithuanian worker's wages bought slightly more meat than those of a worker in Poland or Latvia, but bought less of a suit. So, no going to the metropolis that evening, I guess. What I would say is, when we look at Kaunas, our parents, talked often about people going to the opera to hear La Traviata New Year's Eve, and cultural life in cafes, evenings at the metropolis. All of this is perfectly true. However, there is another part of life in Kaunas which should at best be compared to life in cities of developing nations today, be it South America, be it Africa. People flowing in from the countryside, willing to be lucky in the large city, right? And if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. By all available indicators, Kaunas was making progress in improving its social conditions. It was a sleepy Russian garrison town before World War I. In 1920, it had 34 elementary schools, 12 Lithuanian, 11 Polish, 7 Jewish, 3 German, and 1 Russian. By 1935, it had 62 elementary schools. And this was an increase of 82% in 15 years. In addition, the new schools were modern with more facilities, more spacious, better lit. They were built according to international standards, which Kazlauskas also mentions. Finally, the city experienced a marked improvement in its physical plant. Between 1919 and 1929, over 3,800 public and private buildings were erected. And in 1928 to 1932, the city constructed its first public water system. A sewage system had been installed 4 years earlier. So there was progress. Okay? It wasn't a banana republic where people lived miserable lives one generation after another. There was real forward progress. Although there were marginal differences in living conditions and hygienic habits between ethnic groups, they were not nearly as strong as between social strata. It was more important whether you were an unskilled worker or a professional than whether you were a Lithuanian, a Jew, or a Russian. This ranking persisted, if somewhat weakened, even after one took into account the different social composition of each ethnic group. Living conditions and even habits of personal hygiene could initially be inferior among newcomers to those of the older, more established urban dwellers, many of whom were Jewish and German. So, what can I say? This is, I think, a very interesting and very concrete look at life in Kaunas in 1935, 1936, which is something that you don't normally read or hear about. And I hope you have been enlightened and possibly even enjoyed it a bit. Thank you.
No mic here, but we have an hour till dinner, so we have time for some few questions, and then once those are over, I have just a few remarks about the study and Dr. Kazlas' father.
I remember my father telling me when I was looking for a house to buy, but he told me in Lithuania, they only count how many bedrooms. My father said, how many bedrooms in the house? I said, there are 5. 5 bedrooms. I said, yeah, 2 bedrooms only. Well, in Lithuania, they only counted bedrooms. Now, when your father was counting bedrooms per room? When so many people slept, maybe they had 5 rooms and only 1 bedroom.
They were counting all the rooms, including kitchen, whatever else they had, not only bedrooms. And if it was a really crowded family, I suspect that some of them slept in the living room on the sofa. It wasn't just bedrooms.
So just 2 quick questions. One's a comment and then a question. So we have to remember in those times, all those towels had to be hand washed, right? I mean, that was a totally different time as well. The other thing, do you have any idea at all of how much a pair of eyeglasses would have cost of a wage? Because it's kind of interesting, you had a really great statistic with the suit. Because when your dad said he wrote out over 300 prescriptions, and chances were those kids were never going to get glasses anyway. Just
some
curious.
of them,
some of them were not. Any?
No idea.
Okay.
No idea at all.
In the outset, you mentioned the number of schools that were Lithuanian, German, Russian, Jewish. And then you did give us another statistic in 1935 or 6. There were 62 schools total. Do you have any idea how that shifted? Did they more become mostly Lithuanian? Were the splits the same among nationalities? Any information on that?
I know for a fact that there were still Jewish schools. I didn't go out and study what the percentage was of those schools.
Question. In Kaunas, basically today hasn't much changed about the size of the rooms. Families live in practically in 2 or 3 room areas. So the families are maybe today they're a little smaller, but back in the 40s and 50s, they probably were very large. So I'm sure some of the families or kids slept on floors also during later years and even today.
I agree that we don't have particularly huge apartments in Kaunas, or at least I haven't visited any. But what you had were, well, as you yourself said, you had very large families. And these large families were flowing into the city. And sometimes maybe two families had to share an apartment. It was, you know, remember, a 15-year inflow. So we have to think of it as a developing country with a massive infusion of people from the countryside into the city. I look at my own family's example. My father was one of 8 children in Zukia, okay? Small farmer parents. And he and 2 of his brothers moved into Kaunas. He to become a medical doctor, one uncle to become a lawyer, and a third and a second uncle to become a military officer. So it was very much this idea of we're leaving the country, we're going to the city to make our fortune. And by fortune, I don't mean, you know, Rockefeller, I mean to have a decent life of a professional. And this is what all of these statistics reflect in part. The other thing that these statistics reflect, I think, are that culture does matter. And you can, for example, you know, culture and knowledge, however you define them, does matter. That some ethnic groups had better hygiene than others because they had been, my guess, in the city longer, and they had, you know, acquired the habits of urban dwellers. And this was something that could be transmitted by the educational system or by the military, strangely enough.
So just another question. I mean, this is an amazing study that your father and his team did. I mean, 9,600 children is a lot. And I'm thinking at, you know, 5 minutes an eye exam, I mean, that's a long time. Over how much time did they do that? That was my first question. And my second question was, like, in this, I'm sure it wasn't part of the study, but I'm curious because I don't know Kaunas at that time. Like, was it public wells? Was it, like, where were people getting their water from? Because some of the water sources could also have been not the best.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the part about the water sources.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I don't think it was part of this, of his study at all, but I'm just curious because I don't know anything about Kaunas at that time. Like, was it public wells? I mean, what were the water sources? I mean, just curious.
He did mention it in his dissertation, so I don't know the answer to your second question. But, you know, I suspect that there were wells, as you say.
Didn't you say that there was a water system that was developed?
Well, as she said, before the water system was installed, what happened? I'm sorry, what was your first question?
Like, how long did your father take?
Gotcha.
Was he doing it like a PhD dissertation, or what? Was this part of his med school journey?
It was his PhD dissertation, which was published in 1939. He conducted the research in the spring of 1935 and the fall of 1936. And it was basically financed by the university. It was his PhD dissertation. And how did he do so many people? He also had assistants. He examined the eyes of a very large number of people, but some of them were also, some of the examinations of the eyes were done by his assistants. As far as the questionnaires are concerned, they were all, as I said, handed out to the kids to take home so that their parents would help them fill them out. So that didn't require his personal effort in any way.
Well, I think this is it's a typical pattern of what happens in developing countries. But there's a upside to this, because you wouldn't have a transference of large parts of the agricultural population if the efficiency of farmers had not gone up simultaneously. They would only move to cities when they were no longer needed in the countryside. So agricultural productivity goes up in the countryside, you have a surplus population, and it moves to the cities, which was happening in Kaunas. So these people would not have arrived in Kaunas if they were still needed on the farm. Your father's family of 8 kids kind of demonstrated you no longer needed 8 sons or children to do whatever needed to be done. So there's a good flip side to it, because things were improving on the countryside, otherwise they would not have gone to the city for work.
I never thought of that, and I think that's a wonderful insight. That's great. Yeah, the farmers were getting more efficient. So there was modernization in all areas of social life in Lithuania. Again, I don't want you to leave with the thought of Jesus, Kaunas, and hence, therefore, probably independent Lithuania was much worse than I had realized. Yes, there were these problems, and we mustn't idealize that people spent all their time only going to the opera or to the metropolis. On the other hand, as I said before, this was not a banana republic. This is not where one generation after another was mired in rural poverty as the lords, lorded it over them. On the contrary, there was progress. There was real, very impressive progress taking place in Lithuania until 1940. I would like to point out one other thing. Maybe those of you who are quick on math have already figured it out. All this data was collected and analyzed. Well, it was collected 4 years before the Soviet occupation and 5 years before the Holocaust. Okay? So this is like the last picture of ordinary life in Lithuania before kaboom.
I think what Kęstutis said was by far more expansive than what I'm going to say, and more important. But I was also very surprised to know how many of our grandparents actually went abroad to make money. I know my grandfather did. He bought a tavern in New York and actually ran it when the Brooklyn Bridge was being built, and then went back to Lithuania. And then I kept getting surprised when I would talk to other Lithuanians who said that their grandfather did the same thing to make money. And the whole idea was to make money and bring it home. So whether it was to help the farm or to help educate the children, because my father's side also had 11 children, 5 males, and all of them eventually graduated university. Unfortunately, the daughters made high school, but those were different times.
Just to confirm what Vasa said, my grandfather, my father's father, also went to America, to Pennsylvania, worked in the coal mines, made enough money to come back to Lithuania and buy the small farm where he raised his 8 children. My mother's father went to get a factory job in St. Petersburg, unfortunately Russia. And so he returned from St. Petersburg after World War I to Kupiškis, Aukštaitija, and of course lost everything that he had built up that he had saved up when he was working in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Can I just comment on that? You know, there were a number of žemės reformos Lietuvoje, and they had the pavyzdiniai ūkiai, and they had the žemės ūkio
academia Volnovoje and stuff like that. So I totally agree with Kęstutis that, but it was like the government made tremendous efforts to improve the agricultural output, to improve the, the whole žemės reforma, when they parceled out the land and everything to kind of get rid of all the Baudžiavo stuff. So I think in all ways and shapes and forms, as you mentioned, with the water systems and everything, Lietuva was trying so hard, and everything it accomplished in those 22 years in such a small time period was just amazing.
Two very quick comments about the immigration. By all accounts, American historians know that there was a two-way thing across the Atlantic from the 1880s to the First World War. About a third of all immigrants returned. They accomplished their goal. They came here and money went back, which was apparently the purpose of most of them. But of course, a lot stayed. And just a second comment about the education, about the schools, the new 62 schools. The process was that they were mostly Lithuanian. By that I mean where the language of instruction was Lithuanian, not necessarily ethnic, but whatever. And finally, and one of the reasons for that was that the government in Lithuania, all public schools, even for the national minorities, including Jewish schools, were paid by the government. So they encouraged, of course, Lithuanian schools which had Lithuanian as language of instruction more than any others.
Of course, that's very similar to American government schools requiring that a school teach in English. Or am I wrong?
Okay, let's step back for a minute and not focus just on ourselves for a moment. I know the purpose of it is, norim apie Lietuvą sužinot, norim apie Kauną sužinot, and this really was a groundbreaking study. Think about the world today. A number of years, decades later, this country, richest in the world, presumably, perhaps other than China, what's happening in this country in terms of the inequity and the distribution of wealth, the concentration of wealth in what? 5% at the top, 2% at the top, filtering all the way down, and the amount of inequity and the poverty in this country is deplorable. Nothing's changed. Wealth is just a way of distributing itself unfairly. I think that if we go back to Lithuania and focus on that again, heroic efforts were being made. But it's nothing unusual in the world. Go to any country that prides on itself, and you will find the poor, you'll find the homeless, and you'll find the deprived. Now, in a way, it kind of dates back to sort of relates back to something else. Our organization is a Catholic organization. And I think back now to the lecture that Father John gave about the statue on angels unawares. Think about that statue. What does that represent? Inequity, uneven distribution. And talk about the mission of the Pope, the new Pope, Pope Francis. What's his agenda? What's the call for Catholics in action? Address the inequity. Take care of the poor. That's been the Church's mission in this way. So nothing's changed. There's enough left to be done. But the awareness in terms of what happened in our country is, it's universal. It's just the way that, give me an example of a country in the world that actually has done it exactly right. China? Please. So at any rate, sort of, when you look at the big picture and then relate to ourselves, there's a lot clearly to be done everywhere. But to see that relayed, and I think it was, as I say, a groundbreaking study, and incidentally, one of the things that I intended to do, and just give me a moment to master my machine here. Seeing that so much of this is focused on the study, let me give you a few of the fundamentals of the individual that basically did the study, Petro Kazlauskas, and we left this out because we didn't get a chance to do everything that we wanted to do. He was born in 1903, so this year's 120th anniversary since his birth. He died in 1983, 40 years ago, 40th anniversary, an 80-year-old gentleman. The dissertation that you were discussing was actually a requirement for his MD. He got his MD degree in 1939. So basically, as you mentioned, the study was completed by, or at least presented then as a matter. O šiaip tai lietuviškai, because it's come from Wikipedia, on Wikipedia, and so I need to, I'm not an instant translator and I might not get it right. He finished VDU, or Vytauto Didžiojo Universitetą. It may have been Lietuvos Universitetas at the time, I'm not exactly sure, because my parents were from there. Buvo tada jau? Aš nežinau, katrais metais tapo Vytauto Didžiojo, bet rodos diplomas, kur esu matęs, yra Lietuvos universitetas. 1931 he got his 30 medicinos daktaras. Nuo 32 metų dirbo gydytojų Klaipėdos, Telšių, Kauno ir Vilniaus ligoninėse. 41-4 dėstė Vilniaus universitete, 42-4 medicinos fakulteto dekanas, akių lygų katedros, ir akių lygų klinikos vedėjas, nuo 43 profesorius. 44 pasitraukė į Vokietiją, 47.
Švedija.
Ok. Iš kur tas garsas buvo?
Aš ten gimiau.
O sveikinu Juozą, sveikinu švedą, reiškia čia. Ir dabar, šitaip, tai Amerika, Vokietija, Švedija, taip. Ir dabar man pasimaišė, reiškia, Rolandas Kazlauskas. Negiminė. Ir Kazlauskinė, kuri buvo metropolio dainininkė, bet 29 metų amžiaus neišeina, turbūt gerai. Tvarkoj. Dekanas paskiau 47 Amerikoje. I'm looking for corrections. 54 įgijęs teisę čia praktikuoti, reiškia praktiką, privačią praktiką. Jis dirbo Veterans Administration ligoninėje ir, kaip minėjau, 83-aisiais baigė savo žemišką kelionę. Reiškia, tos datos, tarp kitko, žinai, pastebėjaugi 1903 ir 1983, ne, ką nors? Tai mūsų tėvuko yra, reiškia, datos irgi, ir jis irgi buvo dzūkas, tai matyti, bet dzūkam buvo lemta gyventi 80 metų, kada gimti ir kada mirti. Tai va, tai ir aš esu, tarp kitko, iš Kauno, bet aš esu dzūkas iš Kauno. Tai va, tai aš manau, kad gal tuo ir baigsim, laiko dar yra, vienu žodžiu, neskubėkit, gali persirengti visą. Ačiū.